Okay, so just one thing to note, the association implementation, which is unidirectional, bidirectional, regarding, of course, the multiplicity as well. All of these implementations is the same as implementing the aggregation concept. It's the same. Conceptually, it's going to be different between aggregation and association. That's it. Because aggregation really, conceptually, addresses a whole and a part that can be separated. But in association, the relationship, it's not whole anymore. So it's the difference is conceptual, but the implementation is going to be the same, right? So let's take composition in this case. Let's take the famous example of book and chapters. Usually you see book and pages, it's the same concept, right? So in book class, I have an object of book that is being created. It's going to have, any object is going to have title, author, number of chapters. The same with, this is the whole and this is the part. The same with the part, which is the chapter. Any object of the chapter can have the title and the number as well, the number of the chapter meaning. Okay. In composition, implementation actually takes two techniques. First of all, let's define what is composition. Composition is basically creating an object, or it's instantiating an object inside the creation of another object, right? So this is a composition. Association was typically, association and aggregation was typically creating an object of some class, and this is the most important part, elsewhere, somewhere, and then pass that created object to an other object that is being created. So bottom line here is that in association or aggregation, the creation of an object that is being passed is created elsewhere. It's not created inside the other objects, inside the other object that is also being created as well. Like as you saw in person and car. Where was it? Give me a second. It was here, right? So in person and car, you didn't see that I did something like, for example, car. I didn't do something like this, right? I didn't do car like that. I didn't call car and I didn't give it something like a number, for example, and price, etc., etc., like these arguments, right? I didn't create a car inside person, right? So what I did is that I created the car separately and I created the person separately, and afterwards I sent one of them to the other via a method, for example, via the constructor when we were creating person and we were accepting an optional car object, like the start of the implementation of the unidirectional, the start of that video, right? But bottom line is that the objects are being created separately, not inside one another. In the composition, actually the object is being created, the object that is being created inside of another object. That's the whole difference. Now one way to implement this is basically, this is the mainstream, this is the most common one that's gonna see on the internet, is basically the part class and the whole class are individually defined, meaning that you're gonna have class A and then class B underneath. They are individually defined, not nested inside one another, like the method that we have seen inside the lab when we implemented this together. Okay. And that's composition. Whenever you create the part, you call or create an object of the, or I'm sorry, whenever you create the whole, you create an object of that part inside of that whole. And this is what we're gonna do. This is the first method, which actually says that the part class is defined elsewhere, is defined individually, right? As the whole class is defined individually as well. Nothing is defined inside the other. Nothing is a closure of the other. Nothing is defined inside the other. Nothing is nested inside the other. Okay, so this is the first part, and this is the most common way of implementing composition, right? I have a personal rant with this method because I'm going to tell you about it from a developer perspective. nothing can actually prevent me from creating part objects, and this is what we're gonna discuss shortly when we implement this. So let's go and implement the chapter class first. Okay, and let's say that the chapter class is gonna have some class variable that is called titles. So this is something that I just did, right? Just to illustrate an idea. Let's have a dummy chapter that starts at index of 0, right? Or a blank chapter, like this blank page that you see at the beginning of any book. And the actual first chapter at index of 1 is going to be something like, um, uh, um, let's say, how Amy's fell into the magician trap, right? And let's say that the next chapter is Amy's savior, okay? And the final chapter is the dilemma. I'm not sure that I've written this correctly. Okay, so these are the titles of the chapters. Okay, and let's say that the chapter, as we did say here, it takes a title whenever you create a chapter and a number for that chapter, right? So let's define the constructor as it takes a title and as it takes a number. I'm sorry. Yes, let's just say that it takes a number, and you're gonna see in a minute why. So this is the chapter number. Okay, now let us say that here is gonna be the chapter number, which is gonna be chapter number. Okay, this example, by the way, this example is totally of my creation. There's nothing strict about doing the chapter and book in the following details. It's just an idea of mine and how can you implement composition, and it would make sense, not just a arbitrary example of having arbitrary classes like class A and class B. I just want to make something that actually makes sense. And let's say that the title here is gonna be set by another method that's gonna be created shortly. Let's say that we have a method here that is called set title. So set title is literally is going to return void. What it should do is that it implicitly will set the title of that chapter to whatever chapter title or chapter number that we choose from this list, meaning that whenever I create, let's say that all of this finishes, right? So whenever I create, for example, chapter 1 out of the chapter, which is the Bard class, and I say that, can you create that chapter using the title in this, the first title in this chapter titles, right? So if I pass something like 1, notice that it takes a number here. I'm saying that I want chapter 1 to be having the title of the position 1 or index of 1 of that list, right? So I need to index that list with index of 1, which is the past chapter number, right? That's going to be saved into chapter number of that instance that's going to be created. And I'm going to have that title, save it, assign it into self.title. That's the whole idea, right? So title is a class variable. Remember, a class variable area is between the class definition and the constructor. This constructor. So this is the area of any class variable. So set title would be something like this. Remember that it's an instance method, that's why it takes self. What I want to do is the following. What I want to do is that whenever we create a chapter, right, we will pass the chapter number. So typically a chapter number is going to be saved and stored inside the instance chapter number variable. So inside this instance, the chapter number variable is going to have, in this case, 1, right? So if I have the index or the position of the title that I want to assign my book or my chapter with, so I'm just going to take that number that we have took from the user, which is this case at the instantiating statement here, or at the object creation statement here. So I'm just going to take that number which has been saved into via the constructor here, then there, then assigned into that chapter number. I'm just going to take that number and try to access the titles list. Remember, this is a list that can be accessed. You can say, for example, if this is a list, you can say that titles of index of 0 is going to return blank. We don't want a blank. We don't want the dummy or the first page in the book, right? So this is just left there to indicate something meaningful, right? So if I enter something like position 1, I should get the first chapter title. If I enter 2, I should get the Amy Savior, which is the second chapter title, and like that, right? So from title, I would want to index or title my current chapter with the entered number from the user, which in this case, the author who is trying to make, or the developer who is trying to write a chapter and book system, something like that for his client or his author, whatever. Okay, so we're taking that number and we are using it from chapter number to index our favorite title. Okay, that's not enough. If an instance method, as I told you, if an instance method is trying to access a class variable, it needs to say, or it needs to let Python know that this title can be found in the class variable area. So the convention says that I want to access that title from that chapter class. You're not gonna find that title anywhere until you access the chapter class and then search in the class variable area. So you're gonna find the title. Okay, so this is just an extra notation here, but it's the same thing. It's the same thing as saying a list and an index inside of it. That's the same thing, right? Now, set title needs to return that title. So if I say title of 1, in this case, I should return that value, that string, okay? So what will happen when we create the chapter is that that chapter number that we pass when we create the object here is going to be saved into chapter number. And then we can call set title like that, right? So that set title is going to be called whenever we in the creation of this line. All of these lines in the constructor is going to be executed. The first line is going to take the chapter number as we said and save it inside the instance variable chapter number, and then this line, whenever it gets executed as part of creating that object, okay, set title is going to take the saved number inside self.chapter number, right? And it's gonna index the class list or the class variable list titles and return the corresponding chapter title from that position. Okay, it's gonna return it and save it into the title of that book. Now, one thing that's gonna happen, let me just run this. One thing is gonna happen, the error here is saying that set title is not defined. Well, isn't set title a self or an instance method? Well, yes, it's an instance method. So you need to tell Python that you're gonna find this in the instance level. Okay, now let's run this and let's see. There is a small problem. Chapter has no title. All right, so what is the the class? Yeah, the class variable is called titles. I'm sorry. Okay, now let's check chapter 1 dot I'm sorry, let's say print chapter 1 dot you're gonna see that the title is how Amy has fell into the magician trap. Okay, so this is the part class. This is the part class. Okay, now let's take the book or the whole class. Now the whole idea of composition is that the whole class should be the one actually creating what? Should be the one creating the part class. This was just a mere testing code that we written to test our part class, right? So now let's see how the book is defined. The book here takes a title, author, and number of chapters, right? So let's say that the constructor here takes a title for the book and the author name, and it takes a number of chapters. Okay, number of chapters, and let's say that the number of chapters is going to be a default or optional parameter, that at least the book should have 2 chapters. Okay, so let's say self number of chapters, Okay. All right. Now, one thing to complete our two classes is to add some representation for our object of both of them. So here, I'm just gonna say that the representation is going to be something like, let's say that this is gonna be book details, okay, and this is book name. So this is gonna be, or I'm sorry, let's call it book title just for consistency. So this is gonna be self dot title, and we have also book author and self dot author, right? And number of chapters is gonna be number of chapters, and the same thing is gonna happen there. Let's just take all of this and make a class like that, and just say here that here we are going to return something a little bit simpler. So let's say that we are going to return chapter uh, chapter number, right? Okay. Okay. All right. So let's just take this number. It's going to be the actual chapter number. So self chapter number, and here is going to be self the chapter or title, the chapter title. Okay, that's it. So let's for testing, let's just make that chapter one more time, and let's print the actual chapter and see its representation. Okay, so this is how the representation of the object looks like. Now let's do the same thing but for the book, and afterwards we're gonna link them together, and let's give a title of a great story, um, and let's give a number of 2. Okay, and let's try to print B1. Okay. All right, now let's see how can we link those two together. Where is that link? All right, so for I don't really have any we can actually add the title, by the way. It's a public shared, this titles class variable thing, right? It's a list of strings that has 4 elements in the time being, so let's just call it a list like that. All right, it's a list of 4 elements, and it is a class variable, so I might as well just put an underline like there. All right, now we would want to link those two together, so let me have everything like this, and let me just try and say that this is composed of this, right? So this is the composite, this is the whole. Okay, so this is the whole, right? And typically the composite is usually 1, because if it is more than 1, then that's not composition, it's aggregation. In composition, that's really important to note, in composition the composite needs to be a single exclusive container. You shouldn't have multiple wholes or multiple composites of the same for the same chapters or the same parts. Okay, so let's just minimize this, and we can have 1 more chapters. Right, we set the default number of chapters to 2, by the way, so it is like 2 or more, 2 or many. Okay, and the role name, which is basically the reference for chapters in books, is going to be something like this. Like, we need multiple chapters here, so let's call this chapters, and it's going to be a list of chapters of type chapter, right? So it's a list of chapters of type chapter. Okay, this list of chapters can be like from 2 to more than that. So let's just say, since we have only 4 titles in this list, so let's say that, well, let's just set it as like this. It's just a list of chapters. Okay, list of objects of type chapter. Okay, and since we are using the line notation, I'm just gonna remove that one and put the role name here, and this is the chapters. It's going to include the chapters. That's the reference in book for the chapters. Okay, now let's see how can we implement this. Okay, so let's say that in book, all right, we are going to have a variable that is called chapters and set it to a list. And this is the main part, and this is where the composition comes in. Composition, right? So I'm just going to make a loop, right? It's just an implementation detail that I came up with. It doesn't have to be exactly like this, right? So let's say that this chapter is going to be, this book is going to be created. I'm just going to remove all of this. And we don't need, actually, we don't need to create the part anymore. We just are concerned, with the creation of the actual book. So let's say that I'm creating the book with 3 chapters. Okay, so this is the book that I'm creating. Now this 3, I'm going to use it as following. This 3 is the number of chapters. Let's call this 3. This is passed as 3. This is going to be overwritten. So for I in range, and let's start creating chapters starting the first title here. So this is 1, 2, 3. Let's skip the first one because we don't really want to have a chapter that is or a blank page of some sort. So I'm just going to start 1. Notice that this range of numbers is going to be continuing until the number of chapters that the user specifies whenever he creates that book, which in this case is going to be saved into self number chapters. So if the user is trying to create 3 chapters in that book, so this is going to go 1 and 2, right? It's going to go like only 3 chapters, right? I'm sorry, only up till 2. So maybe you would want to have a +1 right there in order to guarantee that you will get the first chapter, the second chapter, right? And the third as well. Okay, so this is gonna be actually okay, so this is to guarantee that I will have 3 chapters starting from index of 1, which is the title, the first title, second title, the third title. Okay. Okay, so with the same exact scenario, I'm just gonna create a chapter like that. I'm passing that index, which is I in this case, to that chapter class or board class, right? And whatever chapters that is gonna be created, I'm gonna take it and append it into self the chapters, which is in this case this guy right there, right? Okay. Now let us run this and see what does book 1 include. You're gonna see that book 1 include number of chapters that is equal to 3, but how about we actually display these chapters? Chapters like that. Self.chapters. Let's run this again. And you're gonna see that these are the 3 chapters that has been created. What about if we created 2 chapters? Then only 2 chapters will be created. Okay, now implicitly we are creating a chapter. The creation, and this is the most important part, the creation of the board class is happening inside the whole class. Or let's just use these interchangeably. The creation of the board object is happening inside the creation of the whole object. in this case, what I mean is that whenever you create a book, implicitly, the number of chapters that you specify is going to be creating for you the same number of chapter BART objects, and it's going to be appended into chapters. All right, and this is basically composition. Okay, another way to do it, let's say that this is method 1. Okay, this is going to be method 2. This is method 2, which is basically nesting the BART class inside the whole class. Now, my personal rant about this method is the following. My personal rant is this is defined individually, and this is defined individually. Whether they were in different scripts or in the same script, there is no such thing that can prohibit me from doing something like that. Creating the actual chapter, which is the BART class, which actually violates the composition concept, which is the BART should not be created individually. The BART should only be created from within the whole. So with the whole being created, the BART should be created as well at the same time. Okay? So from a developer perspective, from a dev perspective, right? There is nothing that actually there is nothing that can actually stop me from creating the BART class like that, from instantiating objects from the BART class. Okay, but from the client, that's where my personal rant actually becomes personal. This is the personal thing. I didn't say that this is wrong. I didn't say that this is this has I didn't say that this has issues. I just say that personally, I'm not really convinced that this is the actual full or complete implementation of composition. Because from a developer perspective, I have the code and I'm able to create the BART class, or I'm able to create objects from the BART class as this, like that, right? But from a client or an end user perspective, and this is where my rant actually becomes invalid, and there is no need to discuss this at all. From an end user perspective, I will never give the user a button inside my page that actually says create chapter. This is not gonna happen. The user will not be able to find any button in the user interface that will allow him from the get-go to create any BART or any chapter objects. The only button that the user will see is something like create book. And from that create book, whenever I click on create book, I will be transferred into another view, into another interface, where a button for creating chapters will appear. This is how typically things will go if you are developing a mobile application or web application that involves some concept between two objects that are composition related, right? But otherwise, the end user will never have the ability to create the chapter or the BART class. And this is where my personal rant is actually considered personal. It becomes invalid because, yeah, these are defined separately. But who cares if the end user cannot access them? If the end user will never be will never be able to create or instantiate objects from the BART class, then this composition is totally valid. This implementation, this method is totally valid, right? But from a developer perspective, if someone who wants to check your implementation, if it is solid enough or not, as a developer, I can actually be a little bit mean to you as a team member, and I would say that, all right, what can prevent me from writing a chapter instantiation or a BART object creation from the chapter BART class, right? Like that in your script. Nothing can prevent me from doing something like that. But that's just being too extra focused into the details. That's it. What matters is that from the end user perspective is that in the GUI, I'm not gonna give him a button in order that he can use to create the BART objects from the BART class. Okay? I'm just gonna give him a button to create first the whole, and from the whole he's gonna be transitioned into another view where he can actually now insert chapters or create chapters. Now the other method, which is nesting BART into the whole class, this is something that I personally like, but most of the people don't. And the reason for that is that it becomes really unreadable. For other team members, this becomes really way too cluttered to be easily read. Now, what I mean is that nesting the part class like that inside the book class. Okay, so I have nested that part class like this inside the book class. Okay, a couple of things need to be changed here, which is basically, if you look a little bit closer, now this is the area between the class definition and the constructor. This is the area where we called, this is the class variable area. Okay, so if you want to access anything in this area, you need to reference the book class. You need to say that I'm looking for the chapter class, which is inside in the class variable area, or the class method area, which is inside the class area of the book class. So if you want to access the chapter, you actually need to say that this is inside the book class. Okay, do you have any other thing? I think that's it. If we run this, you should have the same exact result. There's no difference, right? So you have the two methods. My point of view is that this is the absolute implementation of composition. Okay, you can never access the chapter class in this way because it's nested inside the whole, right? But from a conventional way of doing things, and to make life easier for you and your team members, you can just define them separately, but just make sure that the creation of one happens inside the other.